Over the past decade, I've written training plans for some of the best climbers in the world. In this video, I'm going to create a training plan from scratch. I'm going to cover 5 key steps. Number 1 is how to build the basic structure. This is the foundation of everything. Number 2 is how to work around lifestyle constraints, the key to consistency. Number 3 is how to review strengths and weaknesses to understand how to program your training properly. Number 4 is how to use specific goals to your advantage. And number 5 is how to choose the right workouts. There are loads of different methods on how to do training properly, and different methods work for different athletes. I'm going to show you my method that I'm going to use for this individual athlete, and you can take all the lessons from this, but this isn't the only way to train. Before we get into the first principle, let's meet Ben, our V9 boulderer. So Ben is actually a friend of mine, and he's going on a trip bouldering this summer, so we're doing a training plan for him. Now, when we look at his testing, which he did a couple of weeks ago, we can see all of the basic numbers we need to know for him to train properly. When we look at Ben's finger strength, we can see he's performing pretty well on a larger edge. So a larger edge is 20 mil, and that's compared to his current grade and his goal grade. But when we look at his performance on a smaller edge, which is 10 millimeters, he's really underperforming. Now, in your climbing, it's worth considering, are you better on a smaller edge or a larger edge, and what do you actually need in your climbing? What we generally see is around 50% of additional load on a smaller edge compared to a larger edge. So in Ben's case, we can see he hung on a 20 mil edge with plus 45 kilos. So I'd expect to see him hanging on a 10 mil edge with around 22.5 kilos. However, he only managed 5 kilos. So this really stands out to me as an area he could improve on. So looking at general fitness, I can see that Ben has underperformed both in base endurance and power endurance. Now, as a boulderer, you do need base endurance so that you can recover between attempts and have good session fitness. You need good power endurance to be able to link a lot of moves in a row. So for any of those longer problems that you want to work on, power endurance is really key. Looking at his general conditioning, I can look at 2 different areas, mobility and his strength. So looking at his mobility, he's underperforming, which as a slightly taller climber isn't so bad, but it shows there's an area for him to improve on. So I think this is something we will work on in his plan. Looking at his general strength, I can tell that he has been going to the gym, which I already know, and that's actually translated really well to some of our testing scores. So we'll carry on working on this, but it's not an area of weakness we need to address dramatically. So what we often see with a lot of climbers is they'll compensate for mobility with more strength, or vice versa. If they're not so strong, they will compensate with mobility. Now, it's really important if you ask yourself, which side of that coin do I usually sit? And if you've got relative balance, you can work on both. But in Ben's case, we need to work on mobility slightly more than the strength. Before we consider any structure to a training plan, let's consider Ben's lifestyle constraints, such as work and family commitments. So Ben currently lives in Sheffield, and I know that his work is currently near the climbing depot, which has excellent facilities and some really good boards to climb on. His work schedule is not very flexible, but he does have Wednesdays off. So he usually works Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, which means that we're going to build the training plan around his working days and his days off. Because Sheffield is so close to the Peak District, Ben often climbs outside on the weekends. So we need to build that into the training program. So Ben often does his unstructured climbing outdoors on the weekends with mates and with a group of climbers. And this is something that is really important to add into your training program if it's important to you. So if you would like to do any social climbing or just unstructured training, this is really important to add in, and it's a priority of the training plan to maintain motivation. So it's something that we really recommend doing. Pretty much every coach in the world uses a basic structure for creating training programs, and they'll look at a macro view. So in this case, we're looking at 12 weeks. That's the biggest extent of time that we have available for this training program. Then we'll look at the mesocycles, which are around usually 3 to 4 weeks long, and that's what I'll be using in this case. And then we'll be looking at microcycles, which are about a week long. So in this case, going from the start of April all the way to the end of midway through June, where he's going on his trip, we're going to build out several different mesocycles. And the way I'm going to do this, and what I often do, is doing several weeks of base training at the start, which means that he's going to be looking at building fatigue, but also building the foundations of his performance later on. I often add in a deload week. Now, this isn't always necessary, but I often use deloads because it provides a psychological break to structured training. Now, you could see physiological improvements in the deload week, but I'm really focused on just a lack of structure to allow the athlete some time just to do free climbing and come back to the next training phase with more motivation than before. So I'm going to add 2 different base phases with deload weeks at the end of them. Now, we're going to be looking at the end of the plan when they're performing. And when we add in a performance week at the end of the plan, because this is the start of his trip, we need to make sure that he's feeling recovered and refreshed before leaving. You don't want to finish a training phase and then go straight into performance, because you'll often be carrying fatigue. So before we do that, we'll add in a taper week, which is still training, but it's just reduced the volume. And we'll add a building phase, which means that he's going to be working on all the really specifics for his trip. So 2 base phases, a base into build, into taper and performance right at the end. The first thing I'm going to add to the training plan now that I've got a basic macro structure is make sure that I add in all of those things I've just talked about, the open outdoor climbing and the trip itself. So you can see at the end on this final week that I've got around 4 bouldering sessions to be done outdoors. Now, as I've put in the notes here, that is in magic wood. And what I've done is just put a little reminder to Ben to start off slowly and build up and take care of his skin, because he's really motivated. I want him to have a really good trip. So let's slow things down at the very start. In the deload weeks, I've added in some open sessions, which are optional. And again, I've made a note just saying this is completely unstructured. It should be having fun, and it's to provide that psychological break before the next period of training, so he comes back more motivated than ever. Now, I often find that people in the deload weeks do try and do too much climbing in one session. So I will remind him that in these weeks, he should finish feeling fresh and he should go into the next training cycle feeling slightly more recovered. So not to push too hard or for too long. The next part of his training I'm going to look at is that priority of outdoor limit bouldering. So when he wants to go outside on the weekend. And what I've done here is I've added 2 sessions in just in case he wants to go out on the Saturday and the Sunday. But what I've done instead is I've provided one as optional, just because he might not want to climb both days. He might have social engagements, so he can do them if he has time. And the other one has an alternative session to it. So you can see there's 2 sessions per week in each of these mesocycles. One of them with an alternative session, which means that if the weather's bad, he knows what to do instead. Now, this is something I get asked a lot, is what happens if I can't go outdoors or I can't have a social session? What training should I do instead of that? And it really depends on what phase of training you're in right now. So to give an example of how to replace an outdoor unstructured session, what I've done here is focus on what phase of training Ben is currently in. So at the beginning of the program, when he's starting off, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on mileage. And again, it's a pretty unstructured session and we're going to go for boulder mileage. Now I've made a note that he should change the wall angles, the different types of holds, so he gets a lot of variety in his climbing. And this is going to help build that fitness, but in bouldering and in an unstructured way. When we go into the second mesocycle, so April into May, we're going to focus more on board climbing. And again, I've made notes on here to go on the board at the depot, which I know has really steep climbs on bigger holds. So again, he's going to have a lot of fun on there. It suits his style, and it means that he can really focus on enjoying an unstructured session. Finally, he's going to mix this up with a longer board session where I have made a note to start spending more time on the smaller holds, on more crimpy holds on that same board. And you can see how that transitions from the mesocycle 2 in the middle here, all the way to the final mesocycle. So he's alternating the type of sessions he's doing based on the stage that he's in of the training plan. Before we take the structure any further and look at really specific workouts, we need to really lean into his specific goals so that we can use those to our advantage and make sure the training is really specific and unique to him. So I've got a list of problems from Ben that he would like to do on his trip, and he's going to Magic Wood, and right at the top of the list is a problem called Piranha, which is a 70 plus. And I know a couple of coaches here at Lattice have already climbed that climb. So I'm going to do a couple of things to gain more information. I'm going to talk to those coaches, I'm going to watch a load of videos on YouTube, and I might even look at comments on ATNU just to make sure I get as much information as possible to help the climber out. So what I've gained from watching the videos and this information is this is a really crimpy problem, and it means that it's going to have to work his weaknesses quite a lot. He needs to have quite good flexibility to keep his hips into the wall and make the most of those small holds, and he needs to have good shoulder stability in that externally rotated position. So all these elements I'm bringing into the plan, and I'll go into more depth later on. Another good tactic that you can use at home, which is much easier to understand than watching the movement patterns, is how much time the climber is spending on the wall. So I'll go onto YouTube and I'll look at the timestamps of how long the climber is on the wall for. And I can see that in this case, you're looking at around 24 seconds. That means that at some point in training, I'm training for that 24-second effort or thereabouts. And that's just a really good way to understand the fitness you need for your goals. Now we've looked at the specifics of Ben's goals, we can start planning in the climbing elements of his training plan. So I've never planned in the conditioning elements before climbing. For me, this is a really skill-based sport and we need to make sure we prioritize the climbing movements above all else. And that's also because of the enjoyment Ben needs. So he really enjoys climbing training over conditioning. So I really need to prioritize that for outcome and for enjoyment. So what I've done is I've planned in these climbing bits, focus on the bouldering elements of his training plan first and foremost. And what you can see on the screen here is I've got 2 different sessions to do in the week. I know that he can do one of these on the Wednesday when he's got a longer day off, and he can do one on another day of the week. Remember, he's still doing 1 to 2 sessions of outdoor climbing as well on the weekend, which is unstructured, but is at his limit. So we have to make sure we take that into account in the overall training load. So as you can see in Mesocycle 1, we've got a combination session here. So the first part of it is board climbing, and that's looking at working on specific board climbs. And I've recommended he does some of that on smaller holds on the depot board. Now I've recommended around 50% success rate on here, please, or higher. So what I want to make sure he does is he's not just projecting his absolute limit. It's really important, particularly in a base phase, to actually be completing climbs and doing lots of movements, because that's when you're building your strength base. Alongside that board session, I've built in 6 in 6, which has specific guidance on that session itself that Ben will receive, but we're looking at building his power endurance. So it's boulders on the minute for 6 minutes as a brief overview. And the reason I'm doing that is because we know that we need to build his power endurance up so that he can perform throughout our trip, and if he ends up on longer problems, and even for Piranha itself. So the second session in this same mesocycle is going to be a mixture of moonboard benchmarks and an endurance component. Now I know that Ben really enjoys climbing on the moonboard, and I think it's really good and applicable to the climbing he wants to do in Magic Wood. So what I've done is I've recommended a grade range here, because we all know that the moonboard can feel quite sandbag, and I don't want him to be thinking about climbing 7C, 7C plus, ready for his trip on the moonboard. So what I've recommended is a slightly lower grade, but again, to provide more consistency and a high success rate. So he's going to do lots of successful climbs in that session. The second part of the session is a one-on-one-off interval style endurance workout. Now, it is an endurance workout because you're forcing recovery, but what you're going to be doing is 1 minute of climbing and 1 minute of resting, and repeating that over and over. The reason why this is really important to do at this stage is it builds the ability for Ben to recover between efforts, and it builds his base endurance. The fact that it's an interval style session means that it's not going to have an interference effect as much with the strength part of the same session, because each of the times he's climbing on the wall is for 1 minute only. So it's a slightly more anaerobic effort, and that means that his recovery off the wall is going to be where he's building that recovery capacity. Now, I found this works really well for a lot of boulderers. Now let's look at Mesocycle 2. So we've not got anything in the deload week before this because he's just doing open climbing, but Mesocycle 2, we're going to change things up a little bit. This is partly to provide a fresh training stimulus, and it's also to provide a psychological change so that he feels motivated to try something new in his workouts. And this is something, again, that I personally use quite often by changing the workouts to keep things fresh and exciting. So what we're going to do at the start of the session is project session, but looking at moves only. So he's going to go on a different type of climb, either on a board, or it can just be boulders around the wall. And he's going to be focusing on a level that's really hard for him, and just try and complete set moves that are on a project level. So he's going to be working at his limit, but he doesn't have to send the problems. It's all about trying really hard movements. To follow that up, he's going to do a body tension boulder session, which means completing the boulders, but not cutting loose. And this is going to really focus on his body tension whilst he's climbing. That will really translate well to later on and on his performance on the trip, because the climbs you want to do often require a lot of body tension. So we're going to work that really specifically in this phase after the harder moves. Now it feels like quite a big session already, but on top of this, because he's only focused on moves and then he's completing boulders with a really specific aim, we're going to add an anaerobic component to that. So another power endurance component to that. And what I've designed for him is a 12 move project session. So it's not full project bouldering, but it's a longer boulder problem that he's going to be working on. And that's going to be the end of that session in mesocycle 2. So hard moves, specific boulder problems, and then a longer boulder problem. So he's working the full range within that one session itself. Session 2 in mesocycle 2, we're going to build on that previous session that we had before, but this time we're going to get him to repeat harder climbs. So again on the moon board, because he enjoys doing that, and that's really important to keep in mind, is we're going to do interval style training on boulders. So I'm going to get him to do 4 boulders 3 times each with enough rest in between that he finds really challenging. And that's really going to build his strength base and movement base on these specific climbs. And we've found this works to great effect where you become much stronger by doing climbs that are slightly lower than your max level, but you're repeating them successfully. And he's going to be doing 4 problems to begin with at the start of the mesocycle, and then build into 5 problems by the end of the mesocycle, just so there's a little bit less of a spike. And it means that he's going to build up the intensity of that workout. The other good thing about doing this in mesocycle 2 is he can use some of those problems that he learnt in mesocycle 1 on the moon board benchmark session. So he's going to take the hardest ones of those that he's already learnt, he knows the movement patterns, and he's going to be able to repeat them in mesocycle 2. Because this is a higher volume session, he's going to have a much easier endurance component afterwards that's just focused on climbing around the wall nice and easily, which is an arcing session afterwards. He could even do this at the beginning to warm up as well. But what I'm trying to do in the second session is make sure it stays nice and simple because he's done so much hard climbing in a row just beforehand. Now, mesocycle 3 is where things change up a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of different key sessions that are becoming more and more specific. So you can see in mesocycle 3 that we have a replica session building in. Now, for a lot of people, you don't need to do replica training. You don't need to be on replica problems at all. And just building general strength and fitness is going to take you a long way. But since replica training has become more popularized, we've actually found that a lot of people get buy-in to their training programs if they do more replica style training before a trip, because you're really feeling like you're doing something specific towards your goal. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to replicate the style of movements and the type of hold you're on. So I've built that into the training program so that Ben can feel like he's really preparing himself best for this trip. Again, I've combined that with a form of anaerobic training, so power endurance training, and that's the ANCAP project that we saw in the previous workout, in the previous mesocycle. Again, that's because he's going to work on a longer climb as part of this session, and he's going to be building that really specific power endurance. So the first part of the session will be on harder moves that replicate the type of climb he wants to do on the trip. And the second part of the session is looking at the length of climbs he wants to do on the trip, so being able to sustain an effort for longer. So the second session in the last mesocycle is a project session, which will be on the moon board again, but we've gone from trying to do benchmarks to repeating climbs and now to projecting on climbs on much harder. And that's because he's building up the intensity throughout this training plan. And to keep things nice and simple, the second part of the session is going to be using that arcing again. And like I said before, he could do this as a warm-up, whatever he prefers. But the intensity of the arcing must remain low to reduce that interference effect, but just help his recovery. As you can see now, we've got all of the climbing built into the training program, and I can even see how the graphs are starting to look, which effectively shows the general loading that he's going to have over this next 12-week period. And that's something I keep in mind throughout all of this. The next thing I personally put into the program is fingerboarding and looking at finger strength, because it's a priority of Ben and it's a really good way to start building out the next part of the plan. So as you can see, I've got 2 different fingerboard sessions throughout this training plan, and that's based on what I know Ben already does and is possible in his training week. But what you can see in this first training session, so combo 3, is I've gone for 2 different grip types, the 4-finger half crimp, which is the top part of this combination, and a 3-finger open position. Now I think having a combo of both of those is really effective and creates a much more adaptable climber. The way that I've built the training is to have a relatively linear training load throughout this, but I've gone from 10 seconds at the start of the plan all the way to 5 seconds at the end of the plan, but I'm going to increase the intensity. So the time and duration will drop of each of those hangs, but the intensity will increase. And you can see on this side that I've actually recommended the different weights to use throughout this training plan based on his testing results. The open 3 component of this combination session is going to start with a longer duration hang, again only using 2 arm hangs, and then go to bodyweight repeaters. Again, this is a personal preference of mine. I think it is really effective to do open 3 hangs for longer durations, and then to do body weight repeaters, because it gets the climber used to being able to repeat movements in that grip position, which they might not naturally find that comfortable. The second session, a lot of you might find quite interesting. I've started off with something really specific, and this is based on some of the information Ben gave me before starting this training program session, is that he finds it really uncomfortable to use front 3 and back 3 grip positions whilst climbing. So I've added that in it as a combination fingerboard session, but the important thing here is he's learning how to use that grip position rather than trying to build specific strength in that position. So the intensity must remain low, and he will adapt by doing that specific training without having to increase the load massively. So just by increasing his familiarity, he will become stronger in those positions. I've only done that for 1 mesocycle because I believe he'll then be able to translate his ability on those holds into his climbing throughout the rest of the training plan. So for the second fingerboard session in mesocycles 2 and 3, you can see a really specific session that is applicable to Ben and his goals, and that is doing full crimp dead hangs and then half crimp dead hangs on a 10mm edge. So trying to improve his ability on that smaller edge. Now, a lot of you might find it quite interesting that I've gone for a full crimp at the start of that session. The reason is I'm going to keep the intensity really low, and he's going to build familiarization with a grip position he doesn't necessarily like, but is going to be useful when he's climbing outside on his trip. And again, I've done this at the start of the session so that he's not fatigued before doing this different grip position, and the intensity is low enough that we're going to focus on familiarity of that position rather than building specific strength. And remember, he should be fully warmed up before doing this. The second part of the session is using the grip position he already is aware of, and we're going to increase the load during that part of the session to build strength on a smaller edge. So again, we've got a learning effect and then a building strength effect, and both of those things make a really, really good training session. The reason we've gone for 2 different workouts in the same week is it's really important to keep the same finger strength that he's got, that is one of his good attributes or better attributes, on a larger edge, and for him to keep building the intensity at that, but then also work on his specific weaknesses in another session. I think if we did any more than this, it might overload his fingers or create some kind of monotony in his training, which isn't always the best for motivation. Again, throughout all of this plan, I keep coming back to the loading graphs, which might not mean much to you at home in terms of being able to understand these from our perspective, but I'm so used to using this program that I can see how his loading is stacking up and where the attributes are lying. So as you can see here, he's got a lot of strength and power elements in his training plan. He's got a moderate amount of fingerboarding and power endurance, and we're starting to look at a regular open session, which means that I can keep track of how his weeks are looking and stacking up. So I know that Ben trains at a commercial weights gym, and so what I'm going to do is make sure that he has at least 1 session a week in there that goes alongside his climbing sessions. And I'm going to keep things really simple. It doesn't have to be that complicated with conditioning. And I know that he already uses some of these bigger lifts. If you know you're doing something and having good effects from it, we know that Ben is already strong. Make sure that you keep things consistent as much as possible until you start to see a decline. So in this case, I'm going to use some of the lifts he's already told me he does, and then I'm going to progress them over the 12 weeks. So we're looking at 4 to 5 lifts in this workout. We're going to look at a big compound movement. To begin with, that's going to be a deadlift, and using the same sets and reps that he already does. But then we're going to go into a combination which I find really good, which is rack pull and overhead squat. The reason I find that really good is the rack pull works your trunk and core in a really good range of motion that's applicable to climbing, and you can use higher loads than a deadlift. And the overhead squat works your stability and strength in an overhead position, as well as still working a good range for your legs and trunk. In the final mesocycle, when we're going into that build phase, we're just going to do rack pull. We're going to increase the load so that he's working on a really high intensity, and that's going to make sure he's maximizing his body tension. Alongside these, we've got some basic pull-ups, which go from a strength stimulus to a max strength. A low row exercise, which is going to be working his mid-back and be really good for pulling it onto steeper terrain. So finally, we're going to add in a pushing component, and we're going to start with the movement Ben already uses, which is a bench press. And then we're going to build into an incline chest press. It's something I find really applicable to climbing because you've got a lot of stability by using dumbbells instead of a barbell, and you're going to work your anterior deltoids and your upper chest, upper pec muscles a lot more, which is going to be really applicable to the climbing positions Ben is looking to perform in. So a lot of people might find these quite complicated movements and at really high level, but the reason why I've given things like deadlift and overhead squat to Ben is I know that he can already lift, he can do it with proper form, and it's something that he really enjoys. Now, everyone doesn't have to do this type of conditioning. It does seem like quite a big gym session, but I know that Ben really enjoys it, and it's clearly helped his climbing so far, and it's something that he finds really helps his performance. When he reduces his conditioning and doesn't do a lot of these lifts, he notices it on the wall. So for him, this is important, and that's why I'm keeping it in there. So now we have this one major gym session in the plan, which is something we know Ben really enjoys and helps his overall strength. We're going to look at some other conditioning movements that are more specific. Now we know that Ben wants to improve on smaller holds, and his goals are based on smaller holds. So we need to look at conditioning movements that really apply to that. So we're looking at a couple of different elements to this. One is the shoulders, and we're looking at prone shoulder rotations and reverse fly IOITs. Both of these things really help shoulder stability and help you suck into the wall and get your chest close to the wall and stabilize movements. So not only is this good for your shoulders, it's really going to help him perform on smaller holds when we know that he's already struggling with his finger strength in that area. So this is a great way for you to get around performance on small holds if you struggle at that. Another part of this is to increase his core strength and mobility. Now, Ben doesn't do much core training at the moment, and we know he's already doing a gym session in the week and a lot of board climbing. So I've only added in a core session in that middle mesocycle. And that's just to increase the training load for the middle mesocycle, but then it means that he's got a pretty manageable load at the start and at the finish. So it's just an addition in there to increase his body tension. The mobility though is something we're going to try and do throughout the training plan because we know that is a priority in his performance, and it's going to help compensate for that smaller hold performance. Based on Ben's profile and what he's told me is he doesn't like doing mobility and flexibility training. So how are we going to hide the broccoli, as it were? What we're going to try and do is add this into each of his warm-ups when he's at the climbing wall. So we're going to do 2 sessions a week where he has to do his flexibility as part of that warm-up protocol. And again, this is going to mean that he's going to be focused, it's at the start of climbing, and it's going to help his performance throughout the rest of the climbing session as he's going to increase his mobility. And I think this is a great way for you at home to improve your flexibility if you don't like doing separate flexibility training. On top of this though, because I know this is a priority and he does have the time to do this, I've added in a second follow along routine, which is really simple, that you can do at some other point in the week. Again, I'm optimistic that he's going to do this, but I know it's going to make a big impact if he does. So I know I've gone through this training plan really quickly and I've not gone into too much detail on each of the steps, but it gives you an overview of the decision-making process that I make when I do a Lattice training plan. And hopefully that gives you insights that you can take into your own training plan journey. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like me to go through this again for a different type of climber or you, comment below with the type of climber, the grade that you would like me to cover, and I'll do it in another video in the future. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.